I've always enjoyed hiking alone. There's something about the silence of the wilderness that makes me feel at peace. No traffic, no people, no distractions. Just me, the land, and my thoughts. I've done solo hikes plenty of times before. I always plan carefully, packing extra food, bringing a physical map, a compass, and a GPS. I don't take risks. I follow trails. I know my limits, and I never let my guard down. This time was supposed to be like all the others, but it wasn't. I had planned a 4-day solo hike deep into a national forest. The trail I chose wasn't officially maintained anymore, but I had found an old map that showed a path leading through a valley, looping back toward a different trailhead. It wasn't completely off-grid, but remote enough that I didn't expect to see anyone else. I drove to the trailhead early in the morning, parked my truck, and locked everything up. My pack was heavy, loaded with supplies, but I felt strong. The weather was perfect, cool air, clear sky. Everything seemed like it was going to be a great trip. The first few miles were easy, just a gradual incline through thick pines. The trail was faint but still visible, just a narrow strip of compacted dirt cutting through the undergrowth. I kept a steady pace, enjoying the fresh air and the sound of birds overhead. By late afternoon, I reached a clearing near a small stream and set up camp. I made a fire, cooked a meal, and sat back, enjoying the quiet. Nothing felt off. Nothing felt wrong. That would change. I woke up early, packed my gear, and started moving. The trail became harder to follow, but I wasn't worried. I had my map and compass, and I could always backtrack if needed. But as the morning stretched on, I started to feel uneasy. It wasn't anything obvious, just small things. The birds had gone silent. The usual background noise of the forest, the rustling of squirrels, the distant sound of water was missing. The air felt too still, too heavy. I tried to shake it off, focusing on my route. Then I saw the first sign that something was wrong. A tree, its bark stripped away in long, deep gouges. The marks were too high to be from a bear and too deliberate to be natural damage. I stopped, studying the tree. The wounds in the wood looked old, dark with rot, but something about them made my skin crawl. I kept moving. An hour later, I found something else. A boot, half buried in the dirt, covered in moss. It wasn't old enough to have been there for decades, but it had been there long enough that the forest was reclaiming it. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a lost hiker had dropped it. Maybe it had been there for years, forgotten. But a mile later, I found the backpack. It was torn open. The contents spilled across the forest floor. A ripped jacket, a rusted knife, a shattered phone. No footprints around it. No sign of where the owner had gone. I felt my stomach tighten. I had a choice: turn back or keep going. I checked my map. I was almost halfway through my planned route. Turning back would mean an extra day of hiking. Going forward would take me to the next trailhead by tomorrow evening. I decided to keep going. That was my mistake. Night 2, the footsteps. I made camp in a small clearing, but I didn't build a fire. Something about the day had put me on edge, and I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I ate a cold meal, listening to the silence around me. Then, sometime past midnight, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The night was still, my tent zipped up tight. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving just beyond my tent. Not an animal. Not a deer. Person. I held my breath, gripping the knife I kept in my sleeping bag. The footsteps circled my tent, pausing every few steps, as if whoever was out there was listening. Then, a long, slow exhale, right outside the fabric of my tent. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Minutes passed. Then the footsteps moved away. I lay there, frozen, until the first light of dawn. I packed up as fast as I could and started hiking. I didn't care about my planned route anymore. I just wanted to get out. But something was wrong. The trail was gone. I retraced my steps, checking my map, my GPS, but nothing matched. The landmarks didn't make sense. The ridgeline was too far north. The creek was running the wrong direction. I wasn't lost, but the land had changed. I kept moving, pushing through dense brush, my injured knee slowing me down. Every so often, I stopped and listened. I could hear them, the footsteps, not close but not far, always just behind me. I forced myself to stay calm. Panic wouldn't help. Then I saw it. The cabin. It wasn't on my map. It wasn't supposed to be here. An old structure, barely standing, hidden in the trees. The roof sagged. The windows were shattered. The door hung open. I didn't want to go inside, but I didn't have a choice. I limped up the steps, stepping into the darkness. The air smelled of rot and damp wood. Then I saw the walls, covered in carvings. Words, symbols, names. Some scratched deep into the wood, others barely legible. And then, the photos, pinned to the far wall, yellowed and curled with age. Pictures of people, hikers, campers, some of them in color, some of them faded, black and white. All of them had the same look in their eyes, fear. I turned and ran. I didn't stop. The moment I stepped outside, I heard them, footsteps crashing through the undergrowth. I didn't look back. I ran until my lungs burned, until my injured leg gave out and I collapsed in the dirt. I listened. Silence. I forced myself up and kept moving. Then, just as the sun started to set, a road, a real paved road. I stumbled onto it, barely able to stand. A truck was coming. I waved my arms, desperate. The driver stopped, climbed in, shaking. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if they were still standing there, watching from the trees. I just wanted to leave. I never reported what I saw. Who would believe me? I told people I got lost, that I sprained my knee and had to find my way back the hard way. That was enough. But I know the truth. I was never supposed to leave, and I was lucky to make it out. I haven't gone hiking since, and I never will. The disappearance of James Hunter. I don't know how to start this. I guess I'll just say what happened, exactly as I remember it. My name is Nathan Carter. I'm 31 years old, and I love hiking. I've been doing it since I was a teenager. Weekend trips, backcountry trails, solo expeditions. I'm not an expert, but I know how to handle myself in the wilderness. That's why I can't explain what happened last fall. It started with a missing person. The trail that wasn't there. James Hunter went missing in October. He was an experienced hiker just like me, liked the quiet, the solitude. He wasn't reckless, wasn't the type to take stupid risks. I had been planning this trip. He told his family he was going on a 3-day hike in the national forest, away from everything, about 6 hours from my town. No phone service. He never came back. Just me and the quiet of nature. They never found plenty of solo camping. I don't know why I fixated on his case. But this trip was different. Maybe because he reminded to go me deeper than ever. Maybe because I had hiked truly in that same area before. I found the perfect spot. Or maybe because I felt like I could find him. A remote patch of forest in a heroic way. Miles from any established trails. I wasn't trying to be some kind of rescuer. I checked satellite images and I knew how people got lost. Made sure there were no roads anywhere nearby. If he had gotten disoriented, I wanted isolation, and I found it. So, I packed everything carefully. After he disappeared, a durable tent, I packed my gear and drove to the trailhead. A small camp stove. It was late November, plenty of food and water, a hatchet. The trees were mostly bare. I always carried a GPS and a paper map. The official search had ended weeks ago. I didn't bring a gun. I never had. I wasn't expecting to find a body. The drive took most of the day. I followed a series of winding dirt roads. I started each one rougher than the last. The first few miles were familiar, well-maintained trails. From there, I hiked. I followed the same route James had taken. The air was retracing his last known steps. The ground covered in a thick layer of pine needles where he supposedly vanished. The deeper I went, I didn't see quieter it got. The trail was clear. No distant sounds of traffic. No sudden drop-offs. No voices. No thick underbrush. But the occasional rustle of wind through the branches. If he had gone missing here, I found my campsite because he left before dusk. I looked around, clearing near a slow-moving anything unusual, surrounded by towering trees. That's when I saw the other path. The ground was flat, it wasn't marked, dry. It was barely visible. I set up my tent indentation, gathered firewood, leading off a small fire as the last almost like an old trail. I ate my meal sitting on a fallen log. I checked my map, watching the flames dance. It wasn't on there. That first mistake, I don't know why I followed the usual sounds. Maybe I thought James had done the same thing. The occasional hoot of an owl. Either
the
way,
distant rustling
I
of an
stepped
animal
off the main
moving
path
through the
and started
undergrowth.
walking.
Nothing out
First,
of place.
it was fine.
I slept
The
deeply.
trail, though faint,
the next morning
was
I
still
decided
there.
to explore.
It wound
I
deeper
followed
into
the
the
creek
woods
for a while,
the trees
stepping
growing closer
carefully
together.
over moss-covered
The air
rocks,
felt heavier,
taking in the stillness
like the forest
of the woods.
was pressing in.
The air smelled
Then I
fresh,
saw the boot,
clean.
It was
I
half
didn't see
buried
any
in
signs
the
of
dirt.
people.
No
Covered
old
in
fire
leaves.
pits, no
The leather was
footprints, no
cracked.
trash.
The
I
laces
hiked for
frayed.
hours. It looked like
Eventually
it had been
looping
there
back
a long
toward
time.
camp as the
I
sun
nudged it
started
with
to
my
dip lower in the sky.
It didn't move,
And that's when
it
I
wasn't
saw it.
James's boot.
A tree.
I knew
stripped
that
of
right
its bark.
away. It
The
was
raw
too
wood
old,
beneath
too
was
weathered,
carved with deep,
but it meant
uneven
something.
cuts. Someone
Not
else
from
had
an
been
animal,
here before,
not from
I kept
weather.
walking.
It was
The cabin, the
deliberate.
trail got
I
harder
stood there,
to follow. The
staring
trees
at it,
grew thicker,
feeling
the
the
first
underbrush
twinge of
tangled.
unease. I checked my
told
compass,
myself it
trying
was
to keep
old.
track of my
Maybe
direction.
someone had been here
South,
years ago,
slightly
Maybe it was
southwest.
nothing.
Then I saw
walked
the
back
cabin.
to camp.
It was small,
shaking off
made
the
of dark
feeling.
wood. That night,
Barely
I
visible
kept the
through the
fire going
trees.
longer than usual.
No windows.
The woods
Just
were
a
quieter
single door
than before.
slightly open.
No wind,
I
no
stopped.
distant animal
There was no
sounds.
reason for
Just
a cabin
stillness.
to be here.
I went to
The
bed,
national forest
trying
wasn't
not to let
private
my
land.
mind wander. No hunting
Somewhere
lodges,
in the
no
middle of the
ranger
night,
stations.
I woke
And yet,
up.
here it was.
First, I wasn't sure
stepped
why.
closer, then I heard
My
it.
boots
crunching over
footsteps.
leaves. Slow,
The door
deliberate,
creaked
as the
moving
wind
just
pushed
beyond
it slightly
the
edge
open.
of my campsite.
Inside, it
I
was
froze,
dark.
listening.
I took out my
The
flashlight
steps
and
circled
shined
my
it
tent.
inside.
Then they
Empty.
stopped.
No
I held my
furniture.
breath.
No
The
debris.
silence stretched.
Just a wooden floor.
Eventually, I must have
covered in
drifted
dust.
back to sleep. Then I noticed
Because I
the
woke up to
scratches.
daylight.
Deep
Everything
grooves in the
looked
wood,
normal,
running
The
in
fire
random
had
patterns,
burned down to
like
embers.
someone had dragged
My
something
gear was
heavy
undisturbed.
across the floor. But on the edge
Over
of
and
my
over
camp,
again,
near the
I backed
trees,
away.
I saw
The
them.
forest felt
Footprints.
too quiet. Not
Then I
mine.
heard something
They
move.
led from the woods,
not inside
circled
the
my
cabin.
tent.
Behind
Then
me,
disappeared
the
back
feeling
into
of
the
being
trees.
watched. I turned
packed
fast,
up
faster than
my
I ever
heart
had in
pounding.
my life. Nothing. The hike
Just
back to my
trees.
truck felt
Just
endless.
silence.
Every
But
few
I knew
minutes,
I wasn't
stopped to
alone.
listen. I listened.
The forest was too
holding my
quiet.
breath. I reached
The air
my
was
truck
thick,
by early afternoon.
unmoving.
The
The
door
smell
was
of
damp
unlocked.
wood and dead
Inside,
leaves filled my
nothing
nose.
was stolen.
Then a branch
But the
snapped.
glove compartment was
Closer
open.
this time.
Paper
I didn't
scattered.
wait. I started
turned
the
and
engine,
walked
back the way
locked
I had
the doors,
come,
and drove,
fast but not
As I
running.
pulled onto
the
the
trail
road,
was harder to
I
follow
glanced
now.
in the mirror.
It was like
At
the
the
trees
edge of the
had shifted.
trees,
Someone was
the
standing,
path less visible.
watching. I
kept
never
my
went
compass
back.
in
my hand, checking my direction. South, slightly southwest. I kept walking. Then I saw something that made my stomach drop. The boot, the same one I had seen before. I had walked in a circle. The descent into panic that wasn't possible. I had been walking in a straight line. Hadn't I? I took a slow breath, forcing myself to think. I wasn't lost. I had a compass, a map. I just needed to reorient myself. I turned, adjusting my direction. North. I walked. Minutes passed. Maybe an hour. The sky was darkening, the air colder. Then I saw the cabin again. The chase I ran. I don't know why I ran, but I did. Branches whipped against my face, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just needed to get out. Then I heard footsteps. Not mine. Something else. Running. Behind me. I didn't turn around. I sprinted, lungs burning, legs shaking. Then a break in the trees. The road. I stumbled onto the dirt, nearly collapsing as I reached my car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I sped away, not looking back. The final clue: I didn't stop driving until I reached a gas station miles away. I got out, leaning against the car, my hands still trembling. That's when I noticed something stuck to my boot. Piece of paper, old, yellowed, torn. One word was written on it in shaky, uneven letters. Run. I never went back. I had always preferred hiking alone. There was something about being deep in the woods with nothing but the sound of my footsteps and the wind in the trees that made me feel in control. No distractions, no waiting for anyone, just me and the trail. I had done plenty of solo hikes before, including a few in remote areas, so I wasn't worried when I planned a trip to explore a lesser-known section of the national forest.
I had found an old map online, scanned from a book written decades ago. It showed trails that no longer appeared on modern maps, old logging roads, abandoned paths, routes that had been forgotten over time. I wasn't expecting anything too difficult, just a long, quiet hike through an area few people visited anymore. I packed light but smart water, food, a first aid kit, a knife, a flashlight, and my GPS watch. My phone wouldn't have service out there, but I brought a paper map and compass as backup. The trailhead was empty when I arrived early in the morning. The first few miles were easy, following a well-marked path through thick trees. The forest was dense but beautiful, sunlight filtering through the leaves, the ground covered in ferns. I moved quickly, enjoying the cool air and the solitude. After about an hour, I reached the spot where the old trail split off. There was no sign, no marker, just a faint gap in the undergrowth where the path had once been. It was overgrown, barely visible, but I could still make it out. I stepped off the main trail and onto the forgotten one. The difference was immediate. The forest felt quieter, the trees closer together. The air was heavy, damp from the morning mist. The trail was narrow, uneven, roots and rocks jutting out everywhere. I had to slow down, stepping carefully, using my hands to push through thick brush. About an hour in, I found the first sign that something wasn't right. A boot print. It was deep in the mud, not fresh but not old either. Someone else had been here recently. I crouched, studying it. The tread pattern was clear, meaning whoever left it had been carrying weight. A backpack, most likely. But the position was strange. The toe was dug in like they had been moving fast. I stood up and kept walking, telling myself it was nothing, probably just another hiker who had come through days ago. Then I saw the second thing, a piece of torn fabric caught on a branch. It was dark, possibly from a jacket or backpack, the edges frayed. I reached out and touched it, damp, not from rain. I swallowed hard, shaking it off. The trail was old. Maybe hunters used it now, or someone had tried hiking it before turning back. I kept moving, following the faint path deeper into the woods. The forest got thicker, the light dimmer. The trees were massive, their trunks covered in moss. I checked my GPS, still tracking. I wasn't lost. Then I smelled it. Rotten. Not strong, but enough to make my stomach tighten. I slowed down, scanning the ground ahead. The smell grew stronger, filling my nose, making my breath come short. Then I saw it. A deer, or what was left of one. Its body was twisted, half hidden in the underbrush, torn open. The ribcage was exposed, picked clean. The legs were bent at unnatural angles. The head tilted back as if it had been dropped there. I felt my skin crawl. Predators did this, but something about it was off. The body hadn't been dragged. No signs of a struggle. No scattered fur or disturbed ground. Just the carcass, left there. I backed away, my pulse hammering. Then I heard it. A sound from the trees. Not an animal. Not the wind. Something moving. I turned slowly, scanning the forest, my heart thudding in my chest. The trees were thick, the shadows deep. I couldn't see anything, but I felt something. Presence. I moved, carefully at first, then faster. My breathing was too loud, my steps too heavy. The trail was harder to follow now, barely visible. I kept glancing behind me, expecting to see something move in the trees. Then I found the footprints, deep, erratic, the kind made when someone isn't walking normally, when they're running. My mouth went dry. They led down a steep slope, disappearing into thicker woods. I didn't follow them. I turned back, heading the way I came. My pace quickened. The forest felt different now, darker, the air heavier. Every sound made my skin prickle. The rustling leaves, the distant creak of branches. I wasn't alone. Then another sound, closer, a crunch of leaves. I didn't stop. I walked faster, my legs burning as I climbed the slope. Every step felt slower than it should have. The ground seemed to pull at me, the air pressing in. Then finally, I saw the main trail. I ran. When I hit the open path, I didn't stop. I kept going until I saw my car. I didn't look back. I got in, locked the doors, and drove. It was only when I was miles away, back in town, that I checked my GPS. The route was there, but something was wrong. The trail wasn't on the map. It didn't exist. I don't know where I went. I don't know what was out there, but I'm never going back. I had been planning this trip for months. A full week alone in the woods, away from everything. No phone service, no people, just me and the quiet of nature. I had done plenty of solo camping before, but this trip was different. I wanted to go deeper than ever, to a place where I was truly alone. I found the perfect spot after weeks of research. A remote patch of forest, miles from any established trails or campsites. I checked satellite images, scoured maps, made sure there were no roads anywhere nearby. I wanted isolation, and I found it. I packed everything carefully. A durable tent, a warm sleeping bag, a small camp stove, plenty of food and water, a hatchet, a knife, a fire starter. I always carried a GPS and a paper map as backup. I didn't bring a gun, I never had before. The drive took most of the day. I followed a series of winding dirt roads, each one rougher than the last, until I reached the point where the forest took over. From there, I hiked. The first few miles were easy. The air was crisp, the ground covered in a thick layer of pine needles that muffled my steps. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No distant sounds of traffic, no voices, nothing but the occasional rustle of wind through the branches. I found my campsite just before dusk, a small clearing near a slow-moving creek, surrounded by towering trees. The ground was flat, dry. It was perfect. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and built a small fire as the last light faded. I ate my meal sitting on a fallen log, watching the flames dance. That first night was uneventful. The usual sounds of the forest, crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the distant rustling of an animal moving through the undergrowth. Nothing out of place. I slept deeply. The next morning, I decided to explore. I followed the creek for a while, stepping carefully over moss-covered rocks, taking in the stillness of the woods. The air smelled fresh, clean. I didn't see any signs of people, no old fire pits, no footprints, no trash. I hiked for hours, eventually looping back toward camp as the sun started to dip lower in the sky. And that's when I saw it. A tree stripped of its bark. The raw wood beneath was carved with deep, uneven cuts. Not from an animal, not from weather. It was deliberate. I stood there, staring at it, feeling the first twinge of unease. I told myself it was old. Maybe someone had been here years ago. Maybe it was nothing. I walked back to camp, shaking off the feeling. That night, I kept the fire going longer than usual. The woods were quieter than before. No wind, no distant animal sounds, just stillness. I went to bed, trying not to let my mind wander. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. Then I heard it, Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving just beyond the edge of my campsite. I froze, listening. The steps circled my tent. Then they stopped. I held my breath. The silence stretched. Eventually, I must have drifted back to sleep because I woke up to daylight. Everything looked normal. The fire had burned down to embers. My gear was undisturbed. But on the edge of my camp, near the trees, I saw them. Footprints. Not mine. They led from the woods, circled my tent, then disappeared back into the trees. I packed up faster than I ever had in my life. The hike back to my truck felt endless. Every few minutes, I stopped to listen. The forest was too quiet. I reached my truck by early afternoon. The door was unlocked. Inside, nothing was stolen, but the glove compartment was open, papers scattered. I started the engine, locked the doors, and drove. As I pulled onto the road, I glanced in the mirror. At the edge of the trees, someone was standing, watching. I never went back. I've camped alone more times than I can count. Some people think it's reckless, but I've always found peace in the solitude. There's something about being deep in the woods, miles from anyone else, that makes the world feel simpler.
No emails.
No traffic. Just me, the trees, and the quiet. This trip was supposed to be like any other. I had planned for 3 nights out in the wilderness, far from any official campsites. I picked a spot deep in a national forest, far from trails, near a small creek. It was a perfect place. Plenty of firewood, fresh water, and total isolation. The first day went smoothly. I parked my truck on an old dirt road, hiked about 5 miles into the woods, and found a clearing big enough for my tent. The trees were thick on all sides, but there was just enough space for a fire pit and a decent view of the creek. I set up camp, gathered firewood, and cooked some simple food over the fire as the sun set. The air was cool, the smell of pine and damp earth strong. As darkness settled in, I sat by the fire, letting the warmth soak in. Nights in the woods can be unnerving if you aren't used to them. The silence isn't really silence. It's filled with distant rustling, the occasional snap of a branch, the wind moving through the trees. I've learned to tune it out. Most noises are just animals going about their business. That first night, I slept deeply, the steady sounds of the creek lulling me into unconsciousness. The second day was uneventful. I spent most of it exploring, hiking further upstream, fishing a little. The sun filtered through the trees. The scent of damp leaves filled the air, and I felt completely at peace. But as the sun started to dip, something felt different. At first, I couldn't pinpoint what it was. The air felt heavier, like a storm was coming, but the sky was clear. The woods were quieter than before. The usual evening sounds, chirping insects, rustling branches, felt more distant, like they were further away than they should be. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was just imagining things. That night, as I sat by the fire, I kept catching myself looking over my shoulder, scanning the darkness beyond the trees. Nothing was there. I forced myself to relax, but my body wouldn't listen. The hairs on my arms stood up. My stomach felt tight. My instincts were screaming at me, but I had no reason to feel that way. I stayed up later than usual, adding more wood to the fire, keeping it burning longer than I normally would. I told myself it was just a precaution, maybe a subconscious habit from too many nights alone in the wild. Eventually, exhaustion won. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and forced myself to sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. First, I didn't know why. Everything was silent, too silent. I listened, barely breathing. No wind,
No insects.
no running water from the creek. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate sound. Leaves crunching, slow, careful. Not an animal. Someone was walking outside my tent. I froze, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The steps were light, measured, as if whoever it was didn't want to be heard. I stayed perfectly still, gripping the knife I always kept near my sleeping bag. The footsteps circled my tent, slow and deliberate. Then they stopped. Right next to me, I held my breath. My fingers tightened around the handle of my knife. Minutes passed. My ears strained for any sound, but there was nothing. No movement.
No retreating footsteps.
Just silence. I lay there, barely blinking, every muscle locked in place. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Felt like hours. Eventually, the exhaustion took over, and I must have drifted off, because when I opened my eyes again, light was seeping through the fabric of my tent. Morning. I sat up slowly, my entire body stiff. My first thought was that maybe I had dreamed it. Maybe it had just been my mind playing tricks. Then, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The ground was disturbed. Footprints, human footprints, circled my tent. They weren't mine. I stared at them, my stomach twisting. They came from the trees, moved around my tent, and then nothing. No footprints leading away, like whoever it was had just vanished. I packed up my camp in record time. I didn't eat, didn't stop to rest. I just stuffed everything into my pack and started hiking back toward my truck. The whole way I felt watched. Every snap of a twig, every rustling leaf made my pulse spike. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my pack in the back, locked the doors, and peeled out of there, dirt kicking up behind me. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. Even now, I don't know who or what was out there. I never saw them, never heard them leave. But I know one thing, I wasn't alone. I moved into the house at the end of summer, in that stretch of time when the days were still long, but the evenings had a hint of fall creeping in. It was a small rental, plain and unremarkable, sitting at the end of a quiet street. A single-story house with 2 bedrooms, a narrow kitchen, and a backyard that was mostly dirt and weeds. Nothing special, but it was affordable, and that was all that mattered to me. The previous tenant had left in a hurry. I could tell by the way certain things had been left behind. An old broom in the closet, a single chair in the garage, a roll of toilet paper still on the holder in the bathroom. The landlord didn't say much about it, only that the last guy had moved out suddenly and stopped answering calls. It didn't seem like my problem. First, everything was normal. I spent my days working from home and my evenings watching TV or scrolling on my phone. The house was old, and it made the usual noises, wood shifting as it settled, pipes clicking in the walls. Nothing that bothered me. Then I started waking up feeling strange. It wasn't just being tired. It was an exhaustion that sank deep into my body, like I hadn't really slept at all. My muscles ached, my back felt stiff, and my head was foggy. Some mornings, I found small bruises on my arms and legs, like I had been pressing against something hard in my sleep. I figured it was just from tossing and turning. Then, one morning, I found the front door unlocked. I was sure I had locked it the night before. It was a habit, something I always did before bed. But there it was, unlatched. I checked the house, looking for signs that someone had been inside. Nothing was missing, nothing was out of place. I convinced myself I must have forgotten. The next night, I double-checked. I locked the door, tested the handle, even stood there for a few seconds just to make sure. The following morning, it was unlocked again. I started feeling uneasy. Then there were the noises. First, they were soft. A faint creak in the living room while I was in bed. The sound of something shifting in the kitchen when I was in the shower. I told myself it was just the house settling, but I started paying more attention. One night, I woke up to a sound coming from the hallway. A slow, deliberate creak. I stayed still, barely breathing, straining to listen. Nothing. In the morning, I found the hall closet door open. I knew I hadn't opened it. I pushed it shut and moved on with my day, trying not to think about it. But things kept happening. Small things. My keys weren't where I left them. The kitchen drawer was slightly open. The light in the bathroom was on when I knew I had turned it off. Little things that didn't seem big on their own, but together, they started to wear on me. Then I started waking up with my blankets pulled off. Some nights, I would wake up shivering, my comforter bunched at the foot of the bed. Other times, it was gone completely, lying in the hallway outside my room. I started locking my bedroom door. But one morning, I woke up and found it unlocked. I tried to tell myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe I was sleepwalking. Maybe I was so exhausted that I was forgetting things, moving things around without realizing it. Then I saw the attic hatch. It was in the hallway ceiling, just a small wooden panel with a pull-down cord. I hadn't thought about it much, hadn't even looked up at it since I moved in. But one day, I noticed it was slightly ajar, just a crack, enough to see darkness beyond it. I grabbed a chair and pushed it shut, making sure it was tight. The next day, it was open again. I felt sick. That night, I barely slept. Every creak, every soft sound made my skin crawl. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something to happen. Around 3 a.m., I heard it. A soft, steady noise. The sound of something moving above me. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then silence. I lay there, heart hammering, until the sun came up. As soon as it was light, I grabbed my keys and left the house. I drove around for a while, trying to clear my head, but I couldn't shake the feeling in my gut. I needed to know. I went to a hardware store and bought a long metal pole, the kind used to change light bulbs on high ceilings. When I got home, I stood beneath the attic hatch, gripping the pole in both hands, and pushed. The hatch lifted easily. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen. Nothing. I reached up, hooked the pole into the latch and pulled. The hatch swung down, revealing a dark opening. I hesitated, then grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen. I aimed the beam into the attic. There wasn't much up there, just exposed beams, a thin layer of insulation, a few old boxes covered in dust. Nothing out of the ordinary. Then I saw the blankets. 3 of them laid out neatly in the corner. Next to them, an empty water bottle, a pile of food wrappers, and a small, worn-out shoe. I stood there, my mind struggling to catch up with what I was seeing. Someone had been living up there. Someone had been coming down at night. I backed away, my hands shaking. I left the house immediately and drove straight to a motel. I didn't go back until the landlord sent someone to check the attic. They found a small hole in the side of the house, just big enough for someone to squeeze through. The latch on the attic hatch had been loose. I moved out the next day. I never found out who had been up there. I didn't want to.